Welcome. Good evening. My name is Rachel Burnham. I am a member of the Rabbi Naiman Mikvah Educational Fund Programming Committee of the Mikvah Emunah Society of Greater Washington. We're very excited to welcome you here this evening. We have been hosting a series of events this year with support from the OU's Women's Initiative, and we were recently awarded an OU Women's Initiative for 2022 Challenge Grant for Innovative Women's Programming. Our Women's Unity series, which will end with an in-person celebration on Hanukkah, is entitled Engaging and Connecting Women in Our Community at All Ages and Stages of Life. Events in the coming months are targeted to different audiences while highlighting and sharing commitment to the community and family. In the chat, you can click on a link to a summary of all the events that we have planned, and we hope that you will take part. Our first event was an in-person challah bake on Sunday, May 1st. And if you were there, you know how wonderful it was to have a cross-section of our community come together with beautiful words of inspiration, dancing, song, and challah baking. The next 4 events will be virtual, recognizing that it's easier for many of us to attend these events over Zoom. And thanks to Zoom, we also have people who may be joining us from outside areas, other communities. And one of our goals is to create an achdut in our community where everyone can come together and feel welcome. If you're in the Greater Washington area, we would love for you to identify yourself as a local by clicking on the reaction icon at the bottom of your screen, and you can click on clapping hands or wave, or feel free to just let us know that you're there. Hi. For those of you who didn't know her, Rabbi Naiman Elvasham was the manager of the Wallerstein Mikvah here in Silver Spring before her Patira 2.5 years ago. She was a renowned mikvah educator and dynamic teacher and social worker who transformed the experience of women going to the mikvah throughout the country. With the blessing of the Naiman family in 2020, the Mikvah Emunah Society established the Rabbi Naiman Mikvah Educational Fund to honor Robin's memory and perpetuate her legacy. And we hope that our efforts pay tribute to the significant contributions she has made in our community, especially the practice of Taharas HaMishpacha. This fund is dedicated to training mikvah attendants and greeters in our community and beyond, providing Taharas HaMishpacha and related educational programming, sponsoring challah classes for brides in the Greater Washington area who are unable to pay for classes, and a Rabbi Naiman Educational Mikvah Fund Programming Committee made up of women from many of our shuls in our area has been planning events since then. Since its inception, the committee has presented 7 programs on topics such as infertility, postpartum depression, pelvic health, mikvah challenges, and how to talk about intimacy with your children. And if you've been there, you know many of you have enjoyed so much of our programming. If you missed any of our past events, recordings are available on our website for you to enjoy at your leisure. Before we get started, here are some housekeeping items. We have placed all participants on mute, and we ask you to keep yourself muted throughout the presentation. We have designed this program to be participatory. In addition to presenting, Liz will be fielding questions from the chat at the end of the formal presentation. So feel free to post your questions in the chat when we invite your observations and comments at a few different moments. Tonight's event is designed to appeal to women and girls over the age of 12, recognizing that not all of us may currently be users of the mikvah, yet mikvah is a foundational institution in our community and water is central to all of our lives. And by exploring how water appears in Jewish art and text, we thought we would all develop an appreciation for its importance and deepen our connection to it. And we welcome 2 speakers who are supremely qualified to delve into this topic. They will trace water imagery from ancient maps, medieval Haggadot, and Monet's gardenscapes to explore how water links Gan Eden to the mikvah. Opening this conversation is Nomi Schneck. Nomi is a PhD candidate studying in medieval art in the Department of Art and Archaeology at Princeton University. She received an MA in Jewish art and visual cultural from the Jewish Theological Seminary and a master's in Bagel from Yeshiva University, Bernard's Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies. She has conducted research at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Department of European Sculpture and Decorative Arts, focused on combining manuscripts, study with a diversity of objects to uncover societal and individual customs and belief. Nomi has taught in Jewish day schools for over 10 years. Also joining us this evening is Liz Yamant. Liz is a senior educator at the National Gallery of Art, where she has worked for almost 20 years. She developed and implemented education for docents and manages school and public tours and provides professional development for teachers. She's received a degree in art history from Manchester University, England, and a master's in museum education from Bank Street College of Education, New York. Liz is passionate about using works of art as an entry point to understanding Jewish texts and practice. And Liz also serves on the board of directors of the mikvah and lives right here in our neighborhood. So those of you who know her, we're very, very proud to have her here. Nomi, we'd now like to turn things over to you to get things started. So thank you again for joining.
Okay, hi everybody. It's great to see all of you. First of all, thank you to everybody who has organized the event. There are so many wonderful women who have been behind the scenes in making this happen, and I really appreciate all of your efforts and work. It's been great to get to know you through this process, and thank you everyone for coming. I'm really looking forward to learning with you in the next hour. So tonight what we're going to be doing is going to be divided into 3 parts. First, we're going to be starting with looking at images of art that relates to the story of Bereshit, of the creation of the world. And then we're going to move to water imagery relating to Gan Eden. And finally, we're going to move to the flood. So all different stories from the beginning of Bereshit. And we're going to tie this all together to some of the significance of mikveh usage. So I think it's an ambitious goal for the next hour, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts and reflections as we delve into the art and text together. All right, so we are going to start right away by jumping into an image. Okay, I'm going to give a brief introduction to this, and then I would love to hear your thoughts about what you're seeing. So what you're looking at is our 2 pages from the Sarajevo Haggadah. Sarajevo Haggadah, some of you may be familiar with it. In the 13th and 14th century, we have a number of beautiful illuminated Haggadot that come from Spain. And the Sarajevo Haggadah is probably the most famous one. One of the things that's so incredible about it is that before we even get to the text of the Haggadah, it's prefaced with a series of images that's telling over Jewish history, starting from creation of the world, which is what we're looking at right here, and it goes all the way until Yosef's bones are being dug up from Egypt and brought to Israel. And so we have this idea that the history of the Jewish people from the beginning of time leading to Yetziat Mitzrayim is then being picked up by those reading the Haggadah on Pesach night and is being carried over into our lives as we celebrate Pesach. And so what you're looking at here are the first biblical images, and it's divided into 8 scenes. If you can make out, there's text above and below that's labeling what's happening here. And so here we have the Haaretz Haita Tohu, the total void of the world before creation begins, and then you can see Yom Echad, the first day, Yom Sheni, and each one of these is a panel that moves us from one day to the next, until ultimately we have this final scene, which is a really strange and interesting scene, but this is representing Shabbat. It's representing rest. I would love to hear from you, and you can put in the chat, what do you notice when you're looking at this? What pops out at you? And there's nothing that's too obvious when you're looking at a piece of art. The most helpful thing to do at the beginning is to just immerse yourself in it and notice every detail. So, for example, I'm happy to demonstrate. One of the first things that pops out at me when I look at this image is the use of red and blue and these contrasting colors switching off. I think it's a really interesting use, and how it's being used stands out to me. So I'm going to give everyone a minute to look at it, and if there's anything that stands out to you, anything that you find interesting, please put it in the chat. Okay, let me read these responses and then we'll see what we can make of them. I see, and feel free to keep adding as I'm reading them. Esther, thanks for starting us off. Esther mentions the arches. These are really fascinating and we're going to get to them. Um, Three basic colors. We spoke of the red and the blue and the green as well. Waves, ridges, and more generally textures, many curved lines and arches, circles, roundness or curves, water, the circles for Yom Rishon. So I think what's standing out for everyone, a general theme that is being picked up on here is, first of all, the geometric abstraction of this image, and we'll look into this more. And second of all, this use of water. It's really interesting. Before creation even begins, we have darkness, and then we have this water below. And then when day one starts, we have, as Esther points out, we have the arches above, and this is water again, even though it might be surprising to see it above. We have water below, we have water above, and then these two features of water become almost like framing mechanisms for all of creation. And so as we move from day to day, each day there's an extra element that's added into, you spoke about the shape, so into the circular cosmos, right? But within each of them, we have this water below, the arches above, that then frame and encapsulate all of creation from within. I'm just checking if anyone added any other comments. No circle for Yom Rishon. Yom Rishon actually starts over here, and so what you're noticing is that before anything, the circle only enters the scene once creation begins. But before creation, it's like there is water and there's darkness, but it's shapeless. There's no circle. Okay, now your observations about the first day and this focus on water are not limited to the Sarajevo Haggadah, but are actually a really interesting feature of ancient and medieval depictions of creation. And I'm going to show you two more for comparison. Close the chat for now. So it's actually really interesting because last week I was teaching a class at Drisha, a summer class, and I asked my students, we're learning Bereshit, and I asked them, we were looking at some of these images, I asked them to visualize, how would you imagine the first pasuk in the Torah, Bereshit bara Elokim? What do you see? And the students imagined a lot of colors and light and a lot of abstraction. There was no mention of water. And yet, in some of our earliest creation images, the focus is almost entirely on water, or water seems to be a huge emphasis in encapsulating what creation is about. So aside from the Sarajevo Haggadah, I'm going to introduce these other two pieces. So the Ashburnham Pentateuch is one of our earliest illuminated manuscripts of the Bible. And what you're seeing here is, this is a Jewish manuscript, this is a Christian manuscript, and without getting into the theological implications of the story, there's a lot of shared iconography between Jewish and Christian art in ancient and medieval art. And what you're seeing are blocks of color and these like outline shapes. We have white, we have brown, we have blue, we have green. All of the blue and green is water. And so the water begins up here and it ends up here, and we have some ground in between, but the water is really, these shapes of water are framing all of the other parts of creation and almost become an emphasis of what's happening through creation. As we move, this is called a Moralized Bible. It's from the 13th century, from Spain. We have a number of them, and all of these Bibles were designed for the French royal family between the 13th and 15th century, and they contain image after image after image of stories from the Bible. And what you see here is, this is an incredible image. We have God designing the world. He's holding in his hand a giant compass. Think back to elementary school math. And drafting a design of the world. Here we have solid matter. And again, everything is being framed by water. So each of these images are very different. And at the same time, we have this emphasis on water in creation. Before I move on, does anyone have any observations or questions about these images that they would like to bring up here, you'll have a chance to do it with Liz at the end of this section. Okay. So, and for those of you who noticed the circular shape with the water being included in it, I want to point out again, we have this emphasis on geometric shape in these images as well, where the world is in this defined cosmos. The compass is articulating a very set shape. Here, again, we have these like very defined shapes that are holding all of creation inside of it. Where does this come from? Is this rooted in Tanakh? Is this an idea that develops later in art? If you look to the story of creation in Tanakh, in fact, water is a major element in what is happening. Let's review some of this together. Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. In the beginning of creation, there's nothing in the world. There's total darkness, and yet, what is there? Ruach Elokim merachafet. God's spirit is hovering al penei hamayim. Even before Yom Echad, even before creation begins, we already have the presence of water. That is the one thing that we can say is present before creation. Now, what are the two major elements of creation? We have the Shemayim, the sky, and the Aretz, the land. For both of those to be created, again, we need the shifting and the movement of these waters. So for the Shemayim, God says, let there be heavens, let there be a sky, Yihi Rakia, the Rakia becomes renamed the Shemayim. And where is the Shemayim placed? Betoch Hamayim, inside the water. Vayihi Mavdil Bein Mayim Lamayim. Think back to the Sarajevo Haggadah image. It's separating between the upper and the lower waters. And this is how the Shemayim is created in Tanakh, right? It's this separation between the waters, and the Shemayim is there. Similarly, with the Aretz, with the land, Vayomer Elokim Yikavu Hamayim. The waters are all gathered from under the Shemayim, El Makom Echad, and this allows for the appearance of the Yabasha, of the dry land. And so, one, water is present from the start. Two, anything else that comes after it, any major elements, only comes through the reorganization of these waters. And so we see this huge emphasis on water in the creation account. Why? What is it about water as a quality that it is so necessary for these steps of creation? Now, before we get to more images, this idea of the importance of water in creation is picked up on in rabbinic literature as well, and I want to show you two examples. Because water is so necessary for creation to come forth, then it almost becomes personified in rabbinic literature, or it does become personified, where it becomes this very active force, and we see God engaging with the water and having to battle it in order to bring forth creation. So we're going to look at these two sources together to see how water is personified in creation. The first is a midrash. It's from Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. Before I go ahead and read this, I see a comment in the chat, so I'm just checking. Oh, they're all framed. The images are all framed. Yes, that goes along. That was from Kate. That goes along with these shapes, that everything seems to be very controlled and organized. So the first one begins Ukeshayetza hadibor mipi hagvura. When God utters the words Yikavu hamayim, to organize the waters, miyad nitka'u hamayim ve'alu l'chasot ha'aretz kivatchila. God is telling the waters that they must organize in order for creation to take place. And what happens is that the waters they become very haughty, they're very proud, and they want to revert back to the original and go back to that choshech al pnei hamayim, like total water over the whole world. Ad shega'ar behem HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so God chastises them. V'kivshan v'natan tachat kapot raglav midram b'shalo shalo lahasif lo legroa. And so he has to kind of like put them in their place and measure them so that they don't get too much and that they don't become too small. And what does he do? He places as a boundary for them the sand. And the sand is showing this limitation on the ability for water to kind of take over the world. What any observations about how water is being characterized in this midrash? Lots of chutzpah. I love that, right? The water is given a lot of power here, right? I mean, I wouldn't necessarily naturally expect that God had to fight with the water in order to be able to create the world. And this chutzpah, as you're putting it, continues in a lot of different midrashim, and we're going to look at another example from the Gemara. A force that has to be reined in. Exactly. Yeah. Very nice. The chutzpah of the water is coming from the fact that there's a power to it, right? That the fact that God has to face it is showing that there's something about it that almost seems to have qualities of, not to be God, but to have qualities of God, to be very forceful. V'amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav, B'sha'a shabikesh HaKadosh Baruch Hu libero ta'olam. Similarly, when God wants to create the world, Amar lo l'sar shal yam. Who does God turn to? He turns to the officer of the sea, the chief of the waters. And he commands him, Patach picha, open your mouth, ubala kol meimot sheba'olam. Swallow up all of the water that's covering the world. Amar lefanav, ribono shel olam, dai she'amod b'shali. God, it's enough that I have to stand in my own, that I have to be constrained. Now I have to do more than that. So the officer is arguing with God. This is too much. I don't want to have to constrain myself more than I'm already doing. And God strikes him and kills him. And there's a reference here to a pasuk in Eov to Rahav. Maybe you've heard of Leviathan, Rahav. These are all these sea monsters that appear in the Midrash, that appear in the Gemara, that God has to fight with in order to create the world. And I think what we're seeing here, why does water become such a powerful force in creation, is because water really stands at this tension between chaos and control, right? On the one hand, left to its own volition, and I think the rabbis are really picking up on this in the Midrash and the Gemara, water can cause complete damage and take over, and is extremely, extremely powerful, and yet we really can't live without it. And so in order to bring life into the world, we need to figure out how to control that force. And this idea, this tension between extreme power, chutzpah, chaos, however you want, whatever you want to call it, and control and refinement, this vacillation between the two is exactly what's happening at creation. How do we take this total chaos and organize it into a world that we can inhabit, and an environment that we can live in? All right, so that is the first section, thinking about imagery of water in creation and how it represents this tension between chaos and control, connecting it to Tanakh and to rabbinic literature. So now I'm going to turn over to you, Liz, to hear your thoughts and contributing art pieces on this.
Thank you, Nomi. When I heard what Nomi was going to speak about, it made me think about whether water, this idea of chaos and control and the power of water as this creative element that gives, that takes away, that is almost anthropomorphic, whether there was a precedent for it in the history of art. And so I turned to American art. And in the next slide, you'll see an image. It's called Thomas Cole's The Voyage of Life. and it's Youth from 1842. It's a huge painting. And we'll talk about it in a minute. It is a 4-part series. This is the second in a 4-part series called The Voyage of Life by the 19th century artist Thomas Cole. So what I'd like to do is, before we go into detail, I'd like you to take a moment and kind of travel on the voyage through the water that you see. Take the journey perhaps that this man in red is taking, and see where it gets you. So just take a minute to travel around the image, and then we'll share some details in the chat. And actually, Nomi, are you able to kind of zoom in and put more details on this image?
I can try. I'm not sure. Let's see.
If not, it's fine. It's fine otherwise.
What would you like me to zoom in on?
Oh, you know what? It's fine because now we want to go from the full slide. So go back to the.
Okay.
Yeah. It's okay. Yeah, that's fine. It's fine. So what are some things that are standing out for you? What are some details that you're noticing as you're looking? Person in the red has the same position as the sculpture on the boat. It's sort of, there's a sense of journey, moving forward. Yeah. The movement of the water. Yeah. And seeing the movement of the water, the castle in the background. Yeah. So we have this image, a journey of sorts through the water. Yeah, there is the water seems relatively placid, not what I would expect to represent in youth. And yet, what I wanted to zoom in on is, if you look on the right-hand side of the painting, you can see, I'm not here, so you can see the water might look a little bit different. Sort of to the left of the palm tree, the water is no longer placid and there are rocks in the way. And so the water in one painting is really playing two roles. It's placid. It's bringing this youth along his journey, along the river, his voyage of life. But then around the corner, the waters become more turbulent, and we don't know what will happen next. And so this is, as I said, a series of 4 images. The first one is childhood, where the baby is born, beautiful, serene waters. This is youth. In manhood, he is literally, about to go into the abyss, and he's praying that he, won't hit a rock. And finally, old age, the water is placid once again as he gets ready to go to the next world. And it's kind of interesting because in American art, this is the most religious a work would be. This is really an allegory of the journey that we take in life, with water as this continuous metaphor, changing as we change, as we stumble, as we age. And this becomes a sort of a powerful a powerful symbol of our lives, if you will. So I just thought it was interesting because if this was a medieval image about life, it would be a much more obviously Christian image. But in the 19th century in America, you're not going to see a lot of religious imagery, although there is an angel on the right-hand side who is kind of letting the man, I think it's a man, go. But you're going to be able to read this image through the symbolism. So the front of the boat, it's very hard to see, but there is an hourglass as this man goes on his voyage of life down the river. So water has this quality, the calmness, the frenzy. It in itself, it is about chaos and control, which I thought was a sort of an interesting parallel to what Nomi was talking about. So with that, any further comments or observations? I encourage you to look at this whole set of the Voyage of Life, childhood, youth, manhood, and old age, and see how the river changes. And someone noticed the castle, so you might think about why there would be a castle for youth. This sort of that dreams, a castle in the air, idealism, you can imagine. So sort of a lot of symbolism. Any other comments? They are at the National Gallery of Art and they hang permanently as a series of 4. Yes. Yeah. All right. So Nomi, back to you.
Okay, thank you, Liz. We're going to move from here to water in Gan Eden. Does water continue to play a significant role as human life enters the world? And if so, what type of role does it play? I know this is a lot of text. I'm going to run you through it and explain the colors here. It's really interesting. The first parak of Bereshit is really well known. And if you move to the second parak, the second chapter, we have what seems to be the end of creation. God finishes creating the world. And then all of a sudden, the Tanakh continues on and almost seems to describe the creation all over again. And this is something that, lots of biblical scholars and commentators have focused on. If you've read Rav Soloveitchik's work on this, he talks about Adam 1 and Adam 2. And there's many differences between this first version and the second version. One of the main differences is the order of creation, where in chapter 2, creation really begins with man, begins with Adam, and then continues by filling in everything, all of man's needs, as opposed to chapter 1, where man is at the climax of creation. And as I was reading through this second chapter again and thinking about the entry of human life into the world, I noticed this emphasis on water with man entering the scene. And so what we see here is that the psukim begin in Parak Bet, Pasuk Hey, that there's no growth yet. You can follow along in the Hebrew or the English. Nothing has grown yet. Why not? Because Ki lo himtir Hashem Elokim al haaretz, because God has not yet sent water, rain on the earth. The Adam ein la'avod et adama, and there was no human to work the ground. And so we see this like symbiotic relationship. Man and water together are necessary in order for life to flourish in the world. And then as we continue to describe the presence of humanity in the world, we continue to interrupt that with descriptions of water. And so the blue are references to water, and the green is references to man, to humanity. So it continues that there is some sort of flow from the ground, and then God creates man. And once we have man and this flow, now there can be the Garden of Eden. Now there can be Gan Eden. And then you would expect from this environment that we would continue on to this pasuk on the bottom in green, where God places man inside this environment. But instead, there's an interruption again describing water, these 4 rivers that flow through the water of Eden. And so this is very strange and interesting to me. But you see this emphasis on this back and forth between water, man, water, man, water, man, where water is dependent on man, man is dependent on water, and these combined create the ideal environment in which Adam can live in. So what does water mean here? I'm going to bring you, let's jump into the images again. So what you're looking at here is a map, an ancient world map. It's really incredible. It's from an 11th century manuscript, but it comes from a 6th century Greek merchant and writer, Cosmas Indicopleustes. It's a Greek name, and it means Cosmas who sailed to India. And he was from Alexandria, and he traveled widely, hence his name, and he wrote about it, and he put together a work that includes many world maps, which is fascinating for an insight into seeing how the ancient world perceived their environment. And so what you see before you is a map of the world. This is all lived world, and it's surrounded by this tight frame of water. Here are the directions. We have north, south, west, and east. And so everything in the world is contained within this rectangular body of water. If you look at this, you might notice that there's something else here. All the way to the right, we have this panel of trees. This over here is actually the Garden of Eden. This is Gan Eden. And there was this idea that the Garden of Eden was really present in the world, and one could access it. One could physically get to it. How would one get to it? Through finding the right body of water. And so you can see here, some of this is text. I know it's a very blurry image, and some of this are rivers, the 4 rivers that run from Eden. And you see the rivers connecting paradise, Gan Eden, to the lived, inhabited world. And we even have, like, up to the Middle Ages, we have traveler logs where people would follow the Nile, and they would hope that if they just kept walking down, kept following the river, it would lead them to Gan Eden, and they really believed that they would reach paradise here on earth. And so there's something about water itself that is linking human life to this idea of paradise, of a transcendent environment. This is not, by the way, this let me phrase it this way, this is found in Jewish sources as well. So, for example, this is a quote from the Gemara in Bechoro, which states, Zechruta Demaya Prat, that the source of all the water in the world is the Euphrates River. Prat is one of the rivers named in Bereshit as being in Eden. And so there was the idea that, and so the rabbis thought that all of the other 3 rivers fed into the Prat, and then Prat linked Eden to the rest of the world. And so there was this idea, a really, really fascinating idea. I mean, if you think about it also, like on a practical level, that water would link us, and thinking back to that Parak Bet of Bereshit, that if we can find those 4 rivers, we can find Eden, and kind of more symbolically that there's something about water that is transcendent, that if we follow water, it will bring us to paradise. Now, the images of Garden of Eden became really popular in the Renaissance, and I've worked on these images a number of times, but I've never really thought about them from the perspective of water. So as I was returning to them in preparation for this talk, I noticed something that I never noticed before, and I think it's interesting that I hadn't noticed it, the presence of water in all of these images. So for example, this is Titian's 16th century Adam and Eve, and when you look at this painting, what drew me to it, and probably what stands out, is the scene of eating from the Eitz Hada'at, right? We have this snake cherub who's handing the fruit to Chava, who's so caught up in the moment. Adam seems to be stopping her, and we're really in this climactic height of the scene. But if you look closer, you might notice in the background, what do we have? This rushing river, right? And so it almost gets overlooked by the action in the scene. Similarly, this is a very different example. This is Jan Bruegel the Elder, who was known for his images, of the Garden of Eden. In fact, he was given a nickname Paradise Bruegel because he was thought to have invented these paradise landscapes. And once again, we have Adam and Chava eating from the Eitz Hada'at, and here it's kind of put in the background, and what becomes the focus is this like very lush, vibrant setting in Gan Eden, where we have this like diversity of animals that are living peacefully on the land. Again, though, we have water in the background, and this kind of reminds me, Liz, of the painting that you were just bringing up, Cole's painting, where the water is leading us on a journey, right? That it's here in Eden, but it almost seems like if you follow it, it's going to take you somewhere else, thinking back to those maps. And we see these mountains in the distance, which seems to be connoting this is the water that if you follow it, it leads us to the known world. And I think it's really interesting that water becomes this physical link to paradise and this symbolic link to the concept of paradise or transcendence. For example, if you think about when you want to go out in nature and relax, what is one of the things that maybe you're drawn to? Sitting at the beach, looking at the water. I know, I think I have my mother-in-law on here, so she can validate what I'm saying, but my husband is a very big hiker, and what makes something a good hike? It always has to include some body of water. Why is that? I think, obviously it's fun, but I think there's something about water, seeing water, that is transcendent, that's elevating. And because of that, it's not just in Eden imagery, but water becomes this transcendent mode in gardens throughout art. And I think a really, really fascinating example of this is Monet's paintings. Monet is 19th and 20th century painter who's thought of as being the leader of Impressionism, and he was really devoted to his garden. He spent decades of his life tending to his garden. He bought this plot of land and really devoted himself to this garden in France, and and again, he had like daily instructions to his gardeners. He had 7 gardeners explaining exactly how to tend to the garden, and he kept expanding it. But even after he bought this plot of land, he bought a second plot attached to it, which had a water garden, and that's where he was able to develop his whole water lilies series, and he really devoted a lot of energy to developing this water garden. And there seems to be this focus on water as necessary for bringing out the beauty and the transcendence of the garden. So does anybody have a question or a comment on some of the images that we just looked at before I wrap this up and turn the second section over and turn it over to Liz? Okay, so we moved from thinking about water as in creation, as vacillating between chaos and control, and this balance as allowing for the creation of the world, into thinking about water as transcendent and having this very deep internal relationship with us, with human beings, and linking us to paradise. Liz, turn over to you.
All right. Yeah. So I was sort of intrigued by this idea that if you follow the water, it leads us to paradise. And once again, I consulted a treasure trove of works of art from the National Gallery of Art. This is Jasper Francis Cropsey's Autumn on the Hudson River in 1860, and it is huge. So let's just take this idea of following water leading us to paradise. And how might you kind of connect that idea to this work of art? What are you noticing in this work that would connect to following water leading us to paradise? What are you seeing here? Many twists and turns in the water. Yeah. And as I said, the actual painting, I think it's like, I don't know, 10 feet by 8 feet. So you can really kind of almost physically immerse yourself in this work of art. So yeah, lots of sort of twists and turns in the water. Notice some of the tiny details. Yeah, the light in the background. The water leads to the horizon, the sky and the horizon line. Yeah. The water is broken up by the land in the foreground. Yeah. So there's sort of lots of areas of water, but there's land in between. What else do you notice if you look really, really carefully? What I do sometimes, I use this triple IF feature where you can kind of zoom in, and I'm sorry we didn't do that today, but I will show you that on the left-hand side, there's, in fact, there's a lot of people in this painting. There are a couple of people with their dog and they're sitting by the water. You know, as you continue through the image, there are little towns, there's signs of industry, there's signs, lots of signs of people, even walking across the bridge there. There's some boats. And so I think this work of art, again, this is 1860, which is kind of interesting because it's right on the eve of the Civil War. So it really suggests a scene which is very harmonious. It's man in harmony with nature. And not quite man controlling nature. So the towns are interesting. Man is creating order, but ultimately, like if you look at the front of the painting, there's the sense of sort of natural decay. This is a symbiotic relationship between man and nature, sort of what Nomi was talking about, a man's coexistence. And then if you sort of look at the center of the painting, and really it is dead center, you see this light, you see the horizon line with light. And that's the sense that God is looking over the world. God is looking over this landscape, and he is the one who is in control. He is creating this harmony and this sense of coexistence between man and nature. We know it's a specific place. It's Storm King Mountain in upstate New York. Yeah, looking over all the twists and turns of our journey. And when you look at it, it actually is, it's a very moving, as a religious person, you know, we obviously don't include images, God forbid, of what we would, you know, of God or any representational images of God. And so for me, looking at this painting and thinking about this light, these rays of light, that illuminate the water, that illuminate the world and create this harmony between man and nature. And I just think it's a, you know, it's a strong idea, and this idea of perhaps following the water to lead us to paradise, as Nomi talked about. So with that, any last comments before I give the floor back to Nomi?
Okay,
right.
thanks, Liz. What does this all have to do with a mikvah? That's why we're here tonight. So let's start bringing it all together. Actually, there's a source that I skipped in the section that will lead us directly to that. So I'm going to go backward for one moment. And this is another midrash that is a fascinating depicts the scene of what happens after Adam thinks about the fact that he ate from the tree and shouldn't have, and feels remorse over it. And what does he do? We're not going to read it inside right now, but he goes to the waters of the Gihon and he immerses himself in it for 7 weeks. And so it's almost like he is going to the mikveh as a way to do tshuva his for his sin. And so it's a really, I think it's a fascinating midrash, where he turns to the water when he feels remorse. And with that, we're going to start thinking about the significance of mikveh and how it might relate to some of this symbolism that we've been talking about tonight. So I wanted to speak about Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan, who was an American rabbi. And I don't know if some of you are maybe familiar with his work. He wrote about mysticism and Jewish spirituality, and he has this very short pamphlet called Waters of Eden, where it's actually very brilliant. He brings together many, many sources to talk about the significance and symbolism of the mikvah. And what Rabbi Kaplan does, what Aryeh Kaplan does, is he links it directly to the stories we were talking about tonight, to creation and the Garden of Eden. He writes, even though a person cannot re-enter the Garden of Eden itself, whenever he associates himself with these rivers or with any other water, he is reestablishing his link with Eden. There's something about water itself that brings us back to Gan Eden. Thus, without even getting to the mikveh. And therefore, when a person immerses in the waters of the mikveh, he's also reestablishing a link with man's perfected state. There's something about mikveh usage that in some way is our entry. Think about those, medieval travel logs. It's our entryway into Eden. And he continues, this explains why the mikveh must be linked to natural water, right? There's something about the mikveh that is supposed to remind us of these flowing waters of Eden. Why is it? What is this significance of water? And so he links us back to the formation and organization of the waters of creation. And this becomes a symbol for us, for humans. Let's move to the second paragraph. The main spiritual concept of water is that of change and development. Think about, the chaos and control, that water is always vacillating between these different extremes. It represents the growth and development of the world towards fulfilling God's purpose, and in this context, the Garden of Eden was watered spiritually as well as physically. As a result, it was an environment where man could grow and develop according to God's ultimate plan. So if we think about our two themes so far, water as vacillating between chaos and control and as always shifting, and water as leading to transcendence, maybe there's something about this vacillation that is transcendent. The fact that it can be so controlled and at the same time can totally control and be so chaotic, it almost is like a representation of us and our vacillations in our growth and our striving in what we do. And so with that, I wanted to conclude with some images from the total destruction of the world that happens, just a couple of prakim, a couple of chapters after its creation, through the flood. And I think these two images, the first one is, I know it can be hard to look at, but I wanted to bring it because it's the earliest example of the illustrated stories of Bereshit from the 6th century Vienna Genesis, and so I think it's just really fascinating to be able to see it. And a lot of the themes that it's showing are picked up on in Hans Baldung's Deluge, 16th century. So I think this one will probably be easier to focus on. What we're seeing is the ark, the teva in the center, and we see literally the water as like recovering the world and bringing us back to that original chaotic state. And we see, it can be hard to look at, like bodies floating around in the water. We see that here as well, and people like clawing onto the teva, trying to get into it. And then there's this stream of light up here, which reminds us again of creation, of light entering the world to create. Here we almost have this undoing of creation. And it's interesting to look at these images along with the story of the flood, because there's something about the flood that really seems to play off of the words of the first parak of Bereshit, and that's showing this undoing of creation. First, the whole flood begins because God sees Ra'at Adam, this evil of man, V'chol yitzer machshavat libo, rak ra, again, this evil. Ra, in contrast to what is the word that's used over and over again in creation? God saw ki tov, that it was good. Here, it's ra. And because of that, God brings mayim al haaretz. There's water. There's this return to this original water covering everything. In fact, when it describes the destruction, it goes through all of the, think about the Sarajevo Haggadah image where we have one feature building upon the other. We have the destruction of God brings water. All of life is destroyed, from the oaf, the birds, the behema, the wildlife, the chaya, the sherets, the creepy, crawly creatures, and then Adam and man. And so again, thinking back to the days of creation and all of life that comes into the world, we have this undoing of it through the flood. And I wanted to conclude with these images because I think we've been talking about water, as a creative force and water as a transcendent force, and here we're seeing water as a destructive force. We're seeing that other end of the cycle, and it's only through that destruction that the creation can take place. And so I want to conclude, and then I'll turn over to Liz for some final thoughts. I wanted to conclude with this mosaic, which is from Sicily. It's a 12th century mosaic from a cathedral that's covered with lots of mosaics of stories from Tanakh. And I think this is an incredible image of the end of the flood because it's showing water at exactly that state. We were talking about water as as managing these fluctuations between chaos and control. On the one hand, we still see the chaos. We see like the floating bodies from the flood and the raven here. We see these hints of water as being chaotic, and yet once again it's being stilled, it's being controlled, and we're being brought back to a moment of recreation. Think about your comments about shapes and organization. Once again, the water is no longer covering all of the land and destroying all, but it's being reformed, and human life is re-entering society again. And so I think these ideas of water as almost like a metaphor of our own trials and triumphs, and because of that, being able to lead us to our own visions of transcendence, come about through these early stories in Bereshit, and may speak to you or may be relevant to ideas of mikveh usage. So with that, Liz, I will turn it over to you for final reflections and thoughts. Thanks.
Okay. Can you just change the slide? Yeah. So I wanted to sort of demonstrate that modern and contemporary images can also be powerful, can also have lessons to teach us. So what I'd like you to do now is, again, take a moment and look at this image really carefully. And then we'll share some of the things we notice, some of the imagery, some of the mark making. What are you noticing in this image? This is yeah. Describe it. The wonderful thing about art, and this is why I chose this profession, no wrong answers. It's all about what you're looking at. Rachel's going right to it. She's noticing this sort of blue wavy line, and she's saying the flow of water through it, the water being central. Well, how do we know it's water? What makes you think it's water? Looks like tie-dye, yes. You're starting to notice the textures, right? The blue, this blue wavy line makes you understand it as water. What else do you notice? How would you describe some of the marks that you see in this work? Got What are you seeing? Disorganized, chaotic. Yeah. Some look like ink stamps. Yeah. Is it land? Is it territory and the water running throughout? How do we read this? It's a contrast between geometric shapes and the flowy shapes, the sort of organic shape, and then these geometric shapes. Absolutely. Painting has stark square boxes while the water flows through. Yeah. All right, so if you move to the next slide, I was going to ask you what questions you had about this artwork, but for the sake of time, I'm going to move I'm going to imagine you're asking questions, and I'm going to give you a little bit of background. So So this work of art is by Linda Benglis, the American artist Linda Benglis, who's born in 1941. And it's watercolor with ink and block printing on handmade Gandhi ashram paper. And Pani Rang is translated in Hindi, Pani, water, and Rang, color. And this work was made in Ahmedabad, India. And Ahmedabad is a place where there's this wonderful artist colony, and the artist Linda Benglis has spent a lot of time there. And one of the things that she found striking was there was a river, the Sabarmati River, that ran through Ahmedabad. And she uses, as you notice, lots of stamps. This is actually handmade paper, but there's a lot of mark making. And someone talked about, I think it was Risa talked about the sense of like chaos, and it's disorganized. There's this contrast between geometric shapes and the flowy shapes. And perhaps there's a suggestion that this river is running through this image, just like the river runs through the city of Ahmedabad. But it's just a suggestion. So in the next slide, I invite you to think about this work of art as a metaphor. If this artwork were a metaphor for something, what might it represent to you? And feel free to connect to some of the things that we've talked about. But let's use this as a way to wrap up our whole presentation as a sort of a takeaway. What is our metaphor for? What is our metaphor here? What is speaking to you? It could just be one detail that is a metaphor for something. You could just focus on the water itself and think about the water metaphorically in your life. So sort of a bridge to you. Calm amongst the chaos. Water as a central unifying force. Like going to the mikveh when life's a bit chaotic. Yeah, I was thinking about that. I was actually looking at this and thinking like, oh, this could be like, mikveh night, like trying to get ready, but that didn't seem positive. We go through different stages in our lives, just like water behaves differently at different times. Yeah, and there's different twists and turns along the way. But it's this constant, and it's a life force that nurtures us along the way too. So I think it's always nice to kind of think more abstractly, to think metaphorically, and sort of sit with this idea of the water that is life sustaining. that gives us life through the mikveh and gives us life in so many other ways. It has, so much importance, so much symbolism. And with that, I will end. We'll end, but are there last thoughts or questions that you have for me or Nomi? What's bubbling up for you? And we can stop the share and see if there's anything that you're thinking about. Nomi, do you want to add anything? No, you're good. Very inspiring and very enlightening. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, Liz and Nomi, thank you so much for this fascinating presentation. I know that I myself have never quite seen anything like it, so this was very enlightening. Thank you very much. We will be putting a link in the chat in case you'd like to make a contribution to support this event or future events. And the link will take you to the Mikvah Emunah Society, where you can make a contribution to the Rabbi Nyman Mikvah Fund. We're also putting a link in the chat with a survey. We'd like to get your reaction to this event. We will also be sending out the survey after the event for those of you who have an email associated with your Zoom accounts. And we ask that you fill it out so that we can continue to make our events responsive to your needs. Liz and Nomi, thank you again so much for giving your perspective on mikvah and helping us understand connection to water and mikvah regardless of our stage of life. Our next event will take place Tuesday, July 19, also on Zoom, and it is entitled 3 Keys to Emotional and Physical Intimacy, Setting the Tone for a Strong Marriage, with well-known Kala teacher and mikveh educator Rachel Greenbaum. And please fill out the survey if you haven't already. Okay, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for this most unique and special event. Again, thank you to Liz and Nomi for making it so just fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And want to wish everyone a good night.
Night. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.